The action genre has evolved over time. Early action films began in the 1920s through 1930. This was the era of swashbuckling movies where heroes would battle the villains. Swashbuckler films filled with adventure, action, and often packed with sword fighting and other adventurous heroic tasks. The 1940s and 50s movies began to take shape of the changing society, thus the beginning of cowboy and war movies. Developing action. During the 1960s, James Bond dominated the genre. The larger-than-life characters, car chases, and combat made the Bond films incredibly popular. Shaping action. The 1970s created a new action style with detectives and urban crime scenes. Movies like You Only Live Twice and Dirty Harry took over this era and led a more modern feel than the previous movies. Action. The 1980s would take over the Hollywood scene and the action genre would force primarily on strong males. This is when Eddie Murphy introduced action comedies as well as the acceptance of more ethnicities. Action genres had more explosions and bigger budgets. The 1990s became an era of sequels, CGI, computer-generated imagery, and futuristic action. The 2000s invited more female actors in the genre, and movies such as Charlie Angels and Tomb Raider became bestsellers. In the early years after the introduction of sound, film dialogue was known as talking pictures or talkies. The first movie presented as a talkie was The Jazz Singer, released in October 1927. By the early 1930s, the talkies were a global hit, and they helped build the foundation for Hollywood. Color movies came about in the 1930s, which was started by Disney cartoons of the early 1930s, such as Three Little Pigs. Color was highly successful in the full-length animated film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in 1937, and in the feature film Gone with the Wind in 1939. These films were shot in so-called three-strip Technicolor, a system in which action was captured on 3 strips of film at one time. Because of cost, however, color movies did not become the norm until the late 1960s. In hopes to attract more of mass society, the movie industry implemented new waves of technology such as widescreen formats, stereo sound, and 3D images. From 1952 through 1954, several widescreen formats were introduced, notably cinema, which required 3 synchronized projectors in CinemaScope and Panavision, both of which used a single projector. CinemaScope, which premiered in the 1953 movie The Robe, used projection, which stretches an image. CinemaScope was less expensive and provided a better image. Also in this decade, the number of color movies increased. In the 1950s in the United States, drive-in theaters became common. The first drive-in movie theater had opened in 1933. The number in the U.S. grew from 800 to 1948 to 6,000 in 1961, which was the high point for the business. And in 1956, more people went to drive-ins than to hardtop cinemas. The drive-in movie business, however, underwent a great decline in the 1970s and early 1980s, in part because people had color TV in the home. In the 1960s, there was greater use of color in movie making. In the United States, concern about the increase in sex, violence, and profanity in movies, however, led to the adoption of movie rating in 1968. Lightweight and portable cameras made it much easier to travel and film at different locations. Toward the end of the 1970s, movies began to be sold on video cassette and on video disc. In the later decades of the 20th century, Hollywood remained popular and worldwide, including television, videos, and DVDs. Characteristics of the 1980s were cinemas. Computers became important in film production, especially for CGI. Such computer animation debuted in the movie Tron, released by Walt Disney Pictures in 1982. By the end of the decade, CGI was lowering the cost of producing certain effects and making possible images that could hardly be created in other ways. In the 1990s, computer-generated special effects became widespread. The first computer-generated 3D character appeared in the 1989 movie The Abyss. The success of Jurassic Park in 1993 made clear to filmmakers the value of CGI. The 1999 movie The Matrix, and the technique called bullet time, used computers to create seamless action for multiple stills. Motion pictures has evolved and computer techniques became more and more important. The method used for creating these effects involved a technically expanded version of an old art photography technique known as time-slice photography, in which an array of cameras are placed around an object and triggered simultaneously. Each camera is a still picture video, not a motion picture camera, and it contributes just one frame to the video sequence. When those pictures are shown in sequence, they create the effect of virtual camera movement, the illusion of a viewpoint moving around an object that appears frozen in time. The bullet time effect is similar but slightly more complicated, incorporating temporal motion so that rather than appearing totally frozen, the scene progresses in slow and variable motion. The camera's positions and exposures were pre-visualized using a 3D simulation. Instead of firing the camera simultaneously, the visual effect team fired the cameras fractions of a second after each other so that each camera would capture the action as it progressed, creating a super slow motion effect. When the frames were put together, the resulting slow motion effects reached a frame frequency of 12,000 per second, as opposed to the normal 24 frames per second of film. Standard movie cameras were placed at the ends of the array to pick up the normal speed action before and after. Because the camera circles the subject almost completely in most of the sequences, computer technology was used to edit out the cameras that appeared in the background on the other side. The Great Train Robbery was one of the first action movies. It was filmed in 1903, and it's regarded as one of America's first westerns. At 12 minutes long, it's considered a huge milestone in this genre. It's one of the first movies cross-cutting. That's when two scenes are shown to be occurring simultaneously, but in different locations. It also used composite editing on location, shooting, and frequent camera movement. Superman is well known for its large-scale visual sequences, all of which were created before the digital age. The Golden Gate Bridge model stood 70 feet and 20 feet wide. Other miniatures included the Krypton Council Dome and the Hoover Dam. Slow motion was used to simulate the vast amount of water for the Hoover Dam destruction. The Fortress of Solitude was a combination of a full-scale set and paintings. RoboCop was filmed in 1987. It was the set in crime-ridden Detroit. It tells a story of how Officer Alex Murphy was murdered by a gang and how he was rebuilt into a half-man, half-machine policeman. It often stopped motion and lots of special effects to make the edit look as if it was moving and shooting.